In this video, we are going to talk about web application architecture. So, we all know that creating a modern web application architecture is very crucial for businesses to remain competitive and meet the growing demand of the user. A well designed architecture ensures flexibility, security, maintainability, scalability, and high performance. In this tutorial, we are going to see what is the web application architecture, what are the factors that you should consider while building the web application architecture. After that, we will see the components of this. We will see various types of the web application architecture. We will see the layers on which this web application architecture works. And we will see some of the best practices that you should follow to create this web application architecture. So, first of all, web application architecture refers to structural design and organization of a client side and server side components. It typically comprises multiple layers that work together to provide a complete solution to the end user. Now, let us talk about the factors that you should consider while building this web application architecture. So, developer needs to consider a wide range of factors. First of all, is high scalability. So, we must take care that your architecture must have highly scalability, right, to handle increasing workloads, and it should be able to scale horizontally and vertically. Also, your web application architecture needs to have modularity. It provide easy testing, modification, and bug fixes. As well as your architecture must be highly secured to protect your sensitive data and prevent unauthorized access. A good architecture is one that have high performance to guarantee a user a fast user experience. It must have high availability that will ensure that application is available even if the system failures. It should have high flexibility. So it should be able to adapt to the changes, requirement and improvements over the time. And it must be well documented. So if your architecture is well documented, it will improve the collaboration and reduce the errors and simplify the maintenance. Now let us see how does the modern web application works. So we have prepared a simplified description of what all things happen while you use web solutions. So first of all, a user opens a web browser and enters in a URL into the web application. The browser sends an HTTP request to the server hosting the web application. The server receives the request and user uses the appropriate server-side component to process the request. The server-side component retrieves the data from the database and generates a appropriate response. This response is sent back to the browser using an HTTP protocol. So the browser receives the response and uses the appropriate client-side component such as HTML, CSS, JavaScript to render the response as the user interface. Now user interacts with this user interface and trigger additional HTTP request to the server if he wants to. The server receives each request and process it using the appropriate server-side component. The server generates appropriate response and sends back to the browser. So this process follows back and forth. Like whenever user wants to do something, he will generate a request that will go to the server, and after that server will respond, and this response will be sent via HTTP protocol. So all this like back and forth process is happening through the HTTP protocol. So once the browser receives the response, it updates the user interface, and this process will continue for all the tasks. Now let us see the component of the web application architecture. So primarily there are two sides. One is front end and back end. So front end is a part of web application that is visible and accessible to the user, and it includes the user interface elements such as button, forms, menus, etc. The backend is a part of application that runs on server. It's not visible to the user directly, but it typically consists the server and the database. Now let us see a description, a diagram for this web application architecture. And this diagram shows us all the components, all the small components that makes up this complete architecture. It has some components that are on server side, some components that are on client side. So let's talk about them in detail. So first is user interface, or over here you can see this is mentioned as user browser. So this is the application that interacts with the user and displays the content. It receives the input It can be implemented using various technologies like HTML, CSS, JavaScript. HTML is used to structure the web page content. CSS is used to style the page and make it visually appealing. And JavaScript is to add interactivity and functionality to the user interface. A good UI design involves understanding the user needs and preference, organizing the UI elements logically and intuitively, and making application easy to use and navigate. Next is web server. So this handles incoming client request and sends back the response. It hosts the web application and serve the HTML pages, images, and other static content. It also manages the connections and sessions and cookies and implements security mechanisms such as SSL or TLS you would have heard of. So it protects you against all kind of attacks. So popular web servers are like Apache and Microsoft IIS or Google Web Server. Now let's talk about DNS. Okay, so this is domain name system. It's a very critical component of web application architecture. It translates the human readable domain name such as www.google.com. So in this, Google is your domain, right? And into some IP address like 192.0.0.1, something like that. So this computer can understand. So the main function is to provide a way so that users to access the web resource using easy to remember domain names, right? You cannot remember that 192.0.0.1, but it's easy to remember something like Google or Yahoo, these names, right? Okay, so that's why the DNS server helps us and facilitating the communication between the server and client. Okay, after that we'll see messaging middleware. What is this? This enables communication between different components and systems, allowing them to exchange message and data with each other. It can handle variety of communication patterns such as point-to-point, publish, subscribe, or request response method. So popular messaging middleware solutions are, Apache Kafka, RabbitMQ, or ActiveMQ. Okay, now let's see load balancer. So it distributes incoming traffic across multiple servers to optimize the resource utilization and maximize throughput and minimize the response time. As a as a result, it improves the performance and reliability of the application. Let's talk about some popular load balancer are like HA proxy or F5 you might have heard of. So let's talk about cache. So cache is an infrastructure component that stores frequently accessed data or resources in the fast accessed memory or storage location. Its primary purpose is to improve performance and scalability. So popular caching solution are like Redis, Varnish, these kind of things. And we have CDN. So CDN is the network of global distributed server that delivers content to the user from the server closest to them. It improves the performance and availability of the application by reducing the latency and network congestion. So popular CDN are Cloudflare, Amazon CloudFront. Now let's see. So these are the several components that are there in application architecture. Now let's talk about the layers of the application architecture. So primarily there are four layers. First is presentation layer. It manages the app user interface dealing with HTML, CSS, JavaScript. It also receives the input from the user and sends it to the business layer for processing and interacting through API or interface. The presentation layer typically includes web components such as controller, views, templates. Now, the second layer is business layer, also called as application layer. It handles the web application business logic. It contains controller, services, and model responsible for performing necessary action to fulfill the user request. The business layer interacts with data access layer to retrieve and manipulate the data whenever needed. The next is data access layer. This layer translates application data into a format that can be stored and retrieved from the data store. It contains the component that interact with the database such as data access objects, object relational mappers, ORMs, right? And stored procedures. After this, the last layer is your database layer. It includes the database management system DBMS and the data stored in the database. This layer stores the data in a structured format that can be easily queried and manipulated by the data access layer. Here are the algorithmic representation of how this layer works. So a user interacts with the presentation layer by providing input through the user interface. So user have given the input to the presentation. Now presentation layer receives this input and sends it to the business layer. So business layer processes this input and performs the necessary action. It retrieves or updates the data using the data access layer. Now the data access layer is the one who retrieves or updates the data in the database layer and sends it to the business layer. So business layer process this retrieved data and generate a response in a way which user can understand and gives it to the presentation layer. Now presentation layer receives the response from the business layer and updates the user interface accordingly. So this process repeats back and forth so that user provides further input, and based on that, our application generates some output and gives it back to the user. So yeah, this is how the layers work. Now let's see the types of the web application architecture. So when it comes about designing and developing application, there are two types, majorly two types, right? Front end and back end. So for front end, let's see, there is single page applications in or called as SPA. Okay, so in SPA, a web application load only once and then dynamically updated the content as the user interact with it. So the data is loaded asynchronously through APIs, making it more responsive and reducing the server workload. This architecture is suitable for applications that require a lot of user interaction and real-time data updates. So some examples of the single page application would be Gmail, your Spotify, and Twitter. Yeah. Let's see the next, which is the server side rendered application. Okay, so also called as SSR. So in this, the server generates HTML pages for each request, and the client receives the final result. Okay, this architecture is suitable for applications that require fast loading time and good search engine optimization, but it can be slower than the single page applications. So examples would be your Airbnb or WordPress or Shopify. These websites use server-side rendered application architecture. After this, let's see progressive web application. So this behaves like a native mobile application with features like offline access, push notifications, and full screen mode. So the architecture is suitable for solution that needs to be accessible on mobile device and have the same user interface as a native application. Let's say the example for this would be, the website or the application of Uber. Yeah, it's a mobile application as well, and you have various mobile applications for that would be Facebook or Forbes or Pinterest, these kind of applications which have a progressive web application architecture. Now let's talk about the backend. So the another type of applicant architecture that you would create, which is backend architecture. So this can be created using so one of the type is microservices. In microservice architecture, the backend is divided into small and independent services that communicate with each other through API. Each service is responsible for a specific function. Let's say there are different functions like authentication, payments, or messaging. So each would have a separate microservice, and those interact with the API, right? This is highly scalable architecture as it allows for more granular control over individual component, but it can be complex to manage. Sometimes it can be very complex to manage. So example is, Netflix, Amazon, Uber. These kind of website uses a microservice architecture for their backend. And next is the serverless architecture. In this architecture, the backend is built using cloud-based solution like AWS or Azure. So each function is responsible for tasks like registering the user or sending email notification. It is highly scalable and cost effective, but difficulty to manage and debug. So example of this would be, the New York Times websites or website of Capital One. So these use serverless architecture for their backend. And this was all in the today's video. Thank you guys. Okay, bye.